Good evening, and also tonight, Mr. Ward's family fights for more actions from the WA government to chase down those who are responsible for his death 3 years ago. But first, a parliamentary review has found WA's horse racing industry need at least 70 million Australian dollars over the next 5 years to upgrade the ageing infrastructure. Susan Scott begins her coverage.
The report found the industry profits dropped during the global financial crisis and that the regulatory body, Racing and Wagering WA, does not have the capacity to fund the necessary upgrades to racetracks across the state.
It also found there is a big gap between required infrastructure funding and what is actually being spent. The report recommends Racing and Wagering WA set up a dedicated long-term infrastructure fund. It says this can be done by lowering the wagering tax rate and quarantining some of the industry's profits. While it acknowledges the industry needs a financial boost, it is strongly recommended against moves to introduce keno and virtual gaming into TABs. Susan Scott, DHK News.
The Public Transport Authority denies there has been a significant jumps in crime and antisocial behaviour on Perth's rail and bus network in the past 12 months. The opposition transport spokesman Kevin Travis says there were almost 10,000 violent, criminal or antisocial acts on trains and buses in Perth in the past 12 months. He wants a parliamentary inquiry into why there has been a rise in numbers of robberies and people caught with weapons or drugs. He says, in fact, there has been a reduction in violent incidents. A war of words has erupted between the Police Commissioner and the Corruption and Crime Commission over a report into police use of tasers. Braden Edwards has more.
The Commission is investigating an incident in which Kevin Spratt was tasered 13 times by police officers while in the East Perth Watch House in 2008.
The Commission is investigating an incident in which Kevin Spratt was tasered 13 times by police officers while in the East Perth Watch House in 2008. Carlo Callaghan has accused the Commission of omitting 2 paragraphs that were in the draft report that said the internal police investigation of the matter was thorough and balanced. The CCC has responded with a statement saying it had not completed the review of the matter and to include those paragraphs would be misleading. But Mr O'Callaghan says the community has the right to hear the full report. Braden Edwards, DHK News.
The supporters of Mr. Ward, an Aboriginal elderly man who died after suffering heat stroke in a prison van 3 years ago, is continuing to protest and ask for an appeal despite the state government's compensation of 3.2 million Australian dollars to Mr. Ward's family. The supporter says the WA government has done no effort to chase down those who are responsible, and they are threatening to continue to protest until their voices are heard.
Christian Porter, who's our Attorney General, he made a public statement when they gave the compensation payout. But basically, you know, what we'd like to see at deaths in custody is a formal apology to the actual family. Like, the government haven't even gone up and made an official apology to the family or sat down and asked the family what they can do, you know, to help them and support them, because they're the ones that are at fault. Mr. Ward would be alive today if it wasn't for the prison procedures that were totally incorrect. Like, they didn't follow no policies, no procedures, and because of that, because they totally neglected their duty of care and their obligations and responsibilities, which is also under legislation, we've got a man who's passed away, and, you know, a wife and children and family that no longer have a husband, father or brother, uncle.
The Chief Executive Donald Tsang says there may be room to relax stamp duty requirements for certain class of property.
Speaking on a RTHK English language foreign program, the Chief Executive stressed that the string of housing measures announced in his policy address were aimed at moderating property prices. He added that the government shouldn't play God with the housing market, and he didn't want to see the market plunge. He said property prices should move in line with inflation. The Chief Executive also said the government would monitor the property market carefully to avoid market speculation. Responding to calls for the government to relax stamp duty for certain types of property, Mr. Tsang said there may be room for changes, but the issue must be handled with care. Isabel Hoofer, DHK News.
7 patients at Wong Tai Sin Hospital have tested positive for human swine flu, with 2 of them in serious conditions. They were among 9 patients, all women aged between 23 and 87, and 2 staff members of an infirmary ward who have contact fever and sore throat since early this month. The infected patients are now on Tamiflu treatment. A sewerage worker has died and 2 others were injured after being struck by a goods vehicle involving a collision with a taxi in Lam Tin. The taxi driver has been arrested on suspicion of dangerous driving. Police says the taxi was traveling downhill when it collided with a parked goods vehicle in Changquanao Road, which then crashed into the workers. The first group of 33 miners rescued from a half-a-mile underground mine has been released from the hospital just after 1 day of observation and testing. Nei Fen reports.
The first group of 33 miners rescued from half-a-mile underground have been released from the hospital after just 1 day of observation and testing. 34-year-old Edison Penna, 52-year-old Juan Alanes, and 23-year-old Carlos Mamani were all released from Copiapo Hospital late on Thursday. The men, who set a world record for survival underground, were in surprisingly good health considering that they were trapped in a wet, hot and dark tunnel for 69 days. In a complicated but flawless operation under Chile's far north Atacama Desert, the miners were hauled out one by one through 2,050 feet of rock in a metal capsule a little wider than a man's shoulders. It took about 24 hours to pull out the 33 miners and 6 rescuers who had gone down the escape shaft to help the men get out. While most were physically well, experts say the most lasting damage could be emotional. Nei Fen, DHK News.
Iran President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad told Islamist militants he was proud of them as he addressed his supporters near the Israeli border. Mamoud reports.
The Iranian president also visited the village of Kana, where an Israeli airstrike in 2006 killed dozens. He visited the graves of the victims of those attacks and later laid a wreath at a memorial. Mr. Ahmadinejad spoke to his supporters who were gathered in Kana and praised the Lebanese army for standing firm against what he calls criminal Zionists. Earlier in the day, he visited the border town of Bint Jebel, dubbed the capital of resistance, because it was a center for Hezbollah guerrilla action against Israel during the Jewish state's 18-year occupation of southern Lebanon. The US and Israel have called Ahmadinejad's visit to the border a provocation that undermines Lebanon's sovereignty. This visit heightens fears amongst many Lebanese, particularly Sunnis and Christians, that Iran and Hezbollah are seeking to impose their will on the country and pull Lebanon into a conflict with Israel. Ahmadinejad has sought to depict his country as an ally of all Lebanese, not just Hezbollah. But Western-backed parties in the country's coalition government have warned that Ahmadinejad is seeking to transform Lebanon into an Iranian base on the Mediterranean. Moyuk Muzahid, DHK News.
Search engine giant Google have announced their intention to bring alternative energy to the United States. The US firm is to invest $5 billion in wind technology, part of a proposed electric transmission line intended to spark investment in the new wind farms off the heavily populated US East Coast, Nei Fen reports.
The move, which is a gamble as no offshore wind installations have yet been built in the United States, marks the internet search giant's latest move away from its core business, joining investments in solar energy and a plan to develop a car that will drive itself. In addition to allowing expected offshore wind turbines to transmit their electricity to the coast, the Atlantic Wind Connection project would stretch from Virginia to New Jersey and could serve as a backup to the onshore transmission grid. Google described its initial 37.5% stake in the project as early stage, leaving open the possibility other investors or lenders would be brought in to finance the actual construction. Nei Fen, DHK News.
A small group of Israelites convened in front of the American embassy in Tel Aviv to protest what they say the pro-Palestinian policy of US President Barack Obama. Moit reports.
Protesters threw eggs and shoes at a photo of the US president while holding signs accusing him of appeasing jihadism. Organizers of the demonstration, a group called Zionist Activism, who say they represent the Jewish secular public in Israel, published the event on Facebook. At that time, the Israeli media described the photo as insulting and disrespectful. On Monday, Prime Minister Netanyahu offered the Palestinians a trade-off to revive peace talks: a new freeze on building settlements if they recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The Palestinians, who have long opposed any such measure, immediately rejected the offer. The direct talks had kicked off in Washington on September 2, but there were only 3 face-to-face meetings before the building freeze expired. In a press release, Zionist activism called the Obama freeze policy an anti-democratic, anti-Semitic, and racist demand that prefers Palestinian rights over Israeli rights in their historical homeland. Moyuk Muzahid, DHK News.
And finally tonight, George Clooney has urged US President Barack Obama to ensure fair elections in Sudan. The actor and activist went to the White House after returning from a visit to Sudan to discuss US involvement in Africa's largest nation ahead of the critical election early next year. Clooney is asking the US and the world community to use international pressure to prevent violence ahead of the election. An independence referendum on South Sudan is likely to split the country into 2.
It appears that we have about 90 days before we could be facing a real disaster again, and we know the players involved. It's the same people that were involved in Darfur, and the same people who once before were in the North-South. And our job in general was to come here today and tell the Senator that we are willing to offer as much support as we can to any effort that we can diplomatically try and end this before people start dying.
And that's the news from DHK. I'm Ivan Leung. Thanks for your company, pleasant viewing, and good night.